for coming back so promptly after lunch. So our first speaker this afternoon is Professor Chris French. Chris French is head of the Anomalistic Psychology Research Unit in the Department of Psychology at Goldsmiths, University of London. He's also a fellow of the British Psychological Society and of the Committee for Sceptical Inquiry.
I was expecting a hiss.
And Chris's talk title this afternoon is Many Happy Returns, the Psychology of Reincarnation Claims. Please make Chris very welcome.
Okay, can you hear me at the back? Yeah? Great, okay. Thanks for the invitation to come and talk today. Thank you to all of you for coming along. I've got the post-lunch slot, so, you know, the room was pretty warm earlier and you've now all had lunch, so I'm going to try and do whatever I can to try and keep you awake. And so in that spirit, we're going to start off with an interactive bit. I'm going to show you some words. Right then, that was fun. Right. Now, a Carl Sagan quote. But this is from his book in 1996, The Demon-Haunted World. At the time of writing, there are 3 claims in the ESP field which, in my opinion, deserve serious study. 1, that by thought alone, humans can, barely, affect random number generators in computers. PK research. 2, that people under mild sensory deprivation can receive thoughts or images projected at them, the Ganzfeld studies. And 3, that young children sometimes report the details of a previous life, which upon checking turn out to be accurate and which they could not have known about in any other way than reincarnation. He goes on to say, I pick these claims not because I think they're likely to be valid, I don't, but as examples of contentions that might be true. They have at least some, although still dubious, experimental support. Of course, I could be wrong. Now, Carl Sagan's one of my heroes, and I tend to agree with what he has to say there. But by one of those spooky little coincidences, the first time I read those words, I was actually lying on the bed in this hotel, the Commodore Hotel in Beirut. I had been invited to take part in a documentary. This was, I think it was broadcast in 1998, so we are going back some here. And the documentary was based on investigating reincarnation claims amongst the Druze. And a lot of my talk today is going to be about that. I'm going to kick off talking a bit more generally about reincarnation claims. But just to say a little bit more about the programme, it was produced by Granite Productions for the Channel 4 series To the Ends of the Earth, and there's a kind of team photo of most of the people that were involved. And the general idea was to send myself, a known skeptic, along as part of the investigation, along with Roy Stemmen, who was the editor, I think probably still is, if it's still going, of Reincarnation International. As you might guess, a believer in reincarnation. He wrote up this investigation for his magazine there, as you can see. And our guide on the trip was this chap, Jad Al-Yunis, himself a Druze, and a very firm believer in reincarnation, and possibly a reincarnation of a member of Shawaddy-Waddy, I'm not sure. Really nice guy, though. Now, there are advantages and disadvantages in doing this kind of thing as part of a TV programme. On the downside, they are mostly interested in making a visually appealing and engaging programme, so you can waste a whole morning just getting a shot of a Jeep going up a mountain road right for them. I think that's more than compensated by the fact that they do a lot of the preparation and the setting up of interviews and so on in advance before you even get there. So it's kind of swings and roundabouts. But with respect to that kind of advanced preparation, particular thanks to Chris Ledger, the producer, and Tima Khalil Majdalani, who was a journalist and researcher who worked on the programme with us. Okay, so having given you that as background, I'm going to talk a little bit about reincarnation in general. First of all, what is it? According to Edwards, the belief that humans do not, as most of us assume, live only once, but on the contrary live many, perhaps an infinite number of lives, acquiring a new body for each incarnation. Or the definition offered by Guili, the return of the soul or essence after death to inhabit a new physical form. Now, I do find the topic of reincarnation absolutely fascinating. In fact, last month I joined the Reincarnation Society, and it was £500. I kind of thought, ooh, don't know whether to or not, it's a lot of money. And then I thought, well, you only live once, don't you? That's the best joke in the talk, it's downhill from here. Okay. Right. Now, what are the kind of arguments that people put forward in favour of reincarnation? Well, there are a number of them, just to give you a few. For some people, it answers the question of what happens to the soul after death. I mean, there are various answers being offered to this question. Some people argue that the soul either goes up to heaven if you've been good and down to hell if you haven't, or maybe souls can sometimes hang around on the earthly plane as ghosts. Of course, this is only a problem to be solved if you believe that there is such a thing as life after death. If you don't believe that there's an immaterial soul, you don't have to explain what happens to it after death. Some people think that it is an explanation, particularly those versions of reincarnation that involve the so-called law of karma, for apparent injustice in the world. Why is it that some people are born into lives of misery and pain, and some people are born into lives of luxury and everything that they want? Well, it's because of either good deeds or bad deeds that they've performed in previous lives. Again, I don't personally find this a particularly convincing argument, much as we would like to believe we live in a just universe. There's actually very little evidence that we actually do. There are other arguments in favour that it can explain some apparently inexplicable empirical observations. So child prodigies, children that from a very young age show amazing levels of ability, like Mozart, for example. How was that possible? Well, maybe in a previous life he was a reincarnation of a composer who had lived previously. Déjà vu, that weird sensation that you've experienced something before, even though you know you haven't. Hypnotic past life regression, I'll say more about that in a little while. And the main topic of this talk, spontaneous memories of past lives. And of course there's déjà vu, that strange sensation that you've experienced something before. Sorry. Right. If you want to read more about the kind of spontaneous cases, I think you can still probably do little better than to read the work of Professor Ian Stevenson, sadly no longer with us, who devoted many, many decades to researching this and produced many cases that do appear to be quite a challenge to skeptics. Now, a few other comments to make about reincarnation. There are lots of different versions of reincarnation from one culture to another. I mean, it's quite interesting that opinion polls show that 25% or so of British adults say they believe in reincarnation. You get similar figures from the States. But obviously in other cultures, the numbers are much, much higher because it's part of their main religion. But there are still a lot of variations there. So one issue that arises is, can you reincarnate into a body of the opposite sex? Or, you know, if you're a man, must you always reincarnate as a man? Of course, we've had a fairly controversial example of this quite recently. Apparently, Doctor Who can reincarnate as a woman. In other cultures, there is sometimes a belief that you don't even necessarily reincarnate as a human being. You might reincarnate as an animal, or even as an inanimate object. You might come back as a milk bottle. Another way in which there's variation is the gap between the death of one physical body and the reincarnation in the next physical body. That can vary enormously from one culture to another. There's also the question of when is it that the soul actually enters the new body? Is it at the moment of conception or the moment of birth? So these are all kind of interesting variations on the basic belief. Now, although I don't find the arguments in favour of reincarnation very convincing, I think there are a number of fairly powerful arguments against it. One is there's the general problem of consciousness. I wouldn't claim for 1 minute that we fully understand the nature of consciousness. We're making progress, but we're a long way from a complete understanding of how it is that the physical brain can generate subjective experiences. But there is a huge amount of evidence that consciousness is reliant on an underlying functioning physical brain. I know that some of you will not agree with that, but that is the general consensus of most modern neuroscientists, with very few exceptions. You've got problems with what we might call womb invasion. Nobody's ever even come close to explaining how it could be that the memories, the preferences, the aptitudes, the skills of one individual could somehow become imprinted in a new individual after the death of their physical brain. And one final problem I'll mention, again, it doesn't apply to all types of reincarnation claim, but many beliefs in reincarnation argue that there is a constant number of souls. Souls can neither be created nor destroyed. Now that clearly contradicts the fact that populations increase and sometimes decrease quite dramatically. So there are serious problems there. I'm going to spend the next section of the talk mainly talking about hypnotic past life regression, just to get it out of the way, really. But I'm going to begin by making a few general comments about the relationship between memory and hypnosis. There are lots of myths around about the relationship between memory and hypnosis. For example, we've all seen lots of Hollywood movies where someone is hypnotically regressed, say back to the scene of a crime, and they're suddenly able to replay it like a video and pick up on the number of the getaway card or whatever else it may be. Well, it is mythology. Hypnosis cannot do that. As it says there, hypnosis is no better than any other technique for retrieving details of witnessed events, and it carries the risk of confabulation. You may end up kind of making stuff up without realizing that's what you're doing. And the memory then feels very real, even though it's a false memory. So this is why, and contrary to what it says for the legend of the picture there, evidence obtained from using hypnotic regression is very rarely admissible in court, because people recognize there are these dangers with it. You may have sometimes seen hypnotic age regression, where people are apparently taken back to their childhood. And it can be very, very dramatic to look at. You get a situation there where someone's behavior changes, their voices change, their mannerisms change. They seem to become a 7-year-old child again. However, when this has actually been looked at in detail by developmental psychologists, it's apparent that what's happening is you're seeing adults behave the way that they think 7-year-old children behave, not the way that real 7-year-old children actually behave. So they'll sometimes be able to do things that a 7-year-old wouldn't be able to do, and sometimes they'll say they can't do things that actually most 7-year-olds could do quite easily. A few other... Again, one of the interesting things is that the people who hold a lot of these misconceptions are actually the people who do the hypnotic regression, which is rather worrying. A study that we published where we surveyed beliefs about hypnosis and memory and so on, we found, for example, a number of beliefs that were quite widely held, not universally by any means, but quite widely, that memories obtained through hypnosis are more likely to be accurate than those simply recalled. Not true. And that hypnosis can be used to recover accurate memories from as far back as birth. Again, not true. Some people go even further than that. They believe that you can use hypnosis to retrieve memories from life in the womb, and some, of course, go even further than that and think you can use hypnosis to actually recover past life memories. Now, again, the use of hypnosis, what you typically find with past life regression is that the version of the past life that you get is the Hollywood version, not the historically accurate version. So if you ask people questions that, if they really were reliving a past life, they would know the answers to. What is the currency in your country at this time? Who's the ruler? Is the country at war? They typically don't know the answers. You'll occasionally get kind of people saying things like, you ask them what year it is, and they'll say 50 BC. Think about it. In 50 BC, they didn't call it 50 BC, okay? But there are one or two very famous cases. You do occasionally get these kind of really, what appear to be very impressive cases. The first one to really catch the public imagination was Bridey Murphy. This was the subject of a best-selling book back in 1956, and also a film was based on this. And it featured the past life regression of a Colorado housewife named Virginia Tighe. And apparently when she was regressed, she reported that she lived in Cork back in the 1800s. She spoke with a thick Irish accent, and she gave numerous details of her life in Cork and even did a little kind of Irish jig, you know, so it was kind of very compelling. Naturally, after this initial success, there were people who looked in more detail and they found that actually the story didn't stack up. There were no records that could be found of a Bridey Murphy living in Cork at that time or any of the people she spoke about. And it turns out that Virginia was an imaginative child and a talented actress who would often deliver monologues in a well-rehearsed Irish accent. And I suppose the clincher was, it turned out she'd had an Irish aunt, and she also had an Irish neighbour when she was a teenager, and the next-door neighbour's name was Bridey Murphy Cockell, I should say. Corkell. So again, well, what it seems that we've got there, to give her the benefit of the doubt, is a false memory. I mean, she can either be making the whole thing up, that's another possibility, but most people believe these are probably false memories. And one more example along these lines, Ian Wilson described a case of a woman who claimed that she'd been tried as a witch in Chelmsford in 1556, along with Mother Agnes Waterhouse, whom many of you will have heard of. She provided accurate details in archaic English, but it turned out that, in fact, again, on further analysis with real language experts, they said, no, that's not real. It sounds like it, but it's the Hollywood version. It's not the real thing. And again, the clincher in this case was the trial actually took place in 1566, but a printer's error had led to it being reported as 1556, and that had been repeated in secondary sources, so clearly she'd got her information from secondary sources. Now, the one that's got a special place in my heart, or the set of cases that have a special place, are the so-called Bloxham tapes. And they've got a special place in my heart because when I first heard about these, it was via a programme on BBC television back in the 1970s, presented by Magnus Magnusson, and I believed every word of it. I used to believe in all this stuff. Arnold Bloxham was a Cardiff-based hypnotherapist who used to record his sessions, and he used to basically sometimes take people back into past lives, apparently, and he would record these sessions. The BBC documentary was broadcast in 1977, and also it was a subject of a book by Geoffrey Iverson, who produced the programme. His star subject was a woman he referred to as Jane Evans. That wasn't her real name, but Jane Evans was a Welsh housewife. She had at least 6 different past life incarnations. In one of them, for example, she was the maid of a French nobleman who lived in the 15th century by the name of Jacques Coeur. And she could describe his house in detail down to the level of ornaments on the mantelpiece. She knew a lot about his business dealings and so on and so forth. You know, really detailed knowledge that the historian said, yep, this checks out. In another incarnation, she was a Roman woman. She was a Roman woman living in Britain at the time of the Roman occupation. Now, the explanation for what was happening here was produced by Melvin Harris. One of the clues that he followed up was the fact that although a lot of these details did seem to check out, there were one or two quite important ones that didn't. So, for example, she insisted that Jacques Coeur was single, whereas the historical record showed quite conclusively he was married and he had children. And that's the kind of thing that most maids would notice. And this provided the clue. It turns out there was a historical novel written about Jacques Coeur. And the novelist had tried writing the novel with him as a married man with a wife and kids, but they just kept getting in the way of the plot. so he took the literary liberty of getting rid of them. But a lot of the rest of the information was accurate and based on historical sources. And similarly, similar explanation for her Roman Britain incarnation. Turns out there's a historical novel called The Living Wood, and we can be sure again that she's basing her memories on the novel rather than reality, because she not only talked about the historical characters that really did live at that time, but also the fictional characters that the author had just made up to help the plot along. So we can be pretty sure. Now, as I said before, it would be possible to argue that, well, yeah, she was just making it up, as were Bloxham's other star subjects. Many people, I think including myself, would argue that actually it's more likely to be an example of, there's a misprint on this that I always only ever see at this point. I should say cryptomnesia, literally hidden memories. And the idea is that sometimes we can take in information and store it away, but forget where it's come from. And then when it bubbles up again during the hypnotic regression session, it feels as if, get the imagery going through our heads, it feels as if it's something that actually did happen to us. Okay. Now, you probably guessed this bit was coming. Which words were presented earlier? Was the word snore presented? Put your hand up if you saw the word snore. Okay. The word chair? No. The word pillow? Yes. The word dream? Yes. The word night? Yes. The word sleep? Ha! Gotcha. Only a few of you, but I got you. The word sleep wasn't presented. It's a very trivial example of a false memory. It's trivial in the sense of you misremembered some words on a list. Big deal. The point about that, all the words that I did present earlier, which again was probably quite ill-judged given what I was saying about you falling asleep. I was very careful not to use the word sleep, by the way, because I realised, no, I mustn't. They'll say, well, it's because you said it, but I didn't. But all the words were linked to the word sleep, but the word sleep itself wasn't presented. Now, the reason that I made you do that, apart from trying to keep you awake, was because it's a commonly used technique in psychology to study susceptibility to false memories. You give people a lot of lists like that. You might have another list where all the words are strongly associated with the word sweet, and another list where all the words are strongly associated with the word water, or whatever. But you present the list, but without those critical lure words. And then we can see how many times you report the words that weren't presented, and that is taken as being, in some studies, as an indication of your susceptibility to false memories. So when we go on to experimental studies of hypnotic past life regression, study by Meyersberg et al. Found it's called the DRM task, the one I've just described. It's named after the people who first popularized it, Dease, back in the 1950s, and Roediger and McDermott more recently, so DRM. They found that people who reported past life memories were more susceptible to false memories, as assessed using the DRM task, and they scored higher on magical ideation, that's kind of, generally kind of magical type thinking, and absorption. That's the tendency to become completely absorbed in, say, a work of fiction, or even a crossword puzzle, but to completely be absorbed by it and cut off the outside world. On the plus side, follow-up study by Meyersberg and McNally, they found that people with past life memories showed reduced fear of death, got to be good, and enhanced meaning in life. So, it's not all bad. Interesting set of studies by the late Nick Spanos and colleagues. They found that volunteers who exhibited hypnotic past life memories scored higher on hypnotic susceptibility and fantasy proneness, so the people with a very, very rich fantasy life, but not on psychopathology, importantly. And they also found, I think this is quite interesting in light of what I was saying earlier, that the content of the memories was strongly influenced by suggestion. So if, before they did the hypnotic regression, they said, one of the interesting things we've found is that in past lives, people are always the same gender as they are in this life, then that's what they got. If they said, one of the interesting things that we've found is that when people are hypnotically regressed, they're often of the opposite gender, then sometimes they would get that. But people are responding to the expectations in that context. Okay, moving swiftly on. The rest of the talk now is going to be just some observations made by taking part in this program all those years ago. A little bit about the Druze. The Druze are a religious sect which broke away from the Ismaili doctrines of Islam in the 11th century. Basically, they put down the shutters in 1042 and said, that's it, no new members now, we've got all we need. So they believed that, that's it. That was the time the number of Druze souls was set to a constant value. They live mainly in Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, and Israel. Arabic-speaking Druze, getting on for 900,000 Arabic-speaking Druze in the Middle East. There is a diaspora. They're kind of found all around the world, Europe, the States as well as. They tend not to intermarry. They're not supposed to intermarry. They do sometimes with other religious groups. Religion is central to Druze culture, and reincarnation is central to their religion. The master plan I had before I went out to take part in this program, so I really didn't know what to expect, was the key will be find a Druze skeptic. Find someone who knows the culture but doesn't believe in reincarnation. I couldn't find anybody. They all believed in reincarnation, so that master plan failed. The Druze are said to be very secretive about their religion, but we didn't find that. We found they were quite happy to be interviewed and to talk to us. The Druze that we interviewed were based in villages in the Shuf Mountains near to Beirut. I'll show you that in a map. And importantly, in their community are the Druze sheikhs. They're the kind of religious leaders. They're very important people within the community. And there's a map. There's Beirut, and there's the Shuf Mountains. Now, they've got a very, very down-to-earth attitude about reincarnation. They don't see it as any big deal, and in fact their word literally translates takamus as changing one's shirt. Thought that would be a nice little picture for the ladies there, and maybe some of the men. Free country. They believe that everybody is reincarnated, but you only remember it if you met a violent death. And given that the Civil War had taken place, there was lots of room for violent deaths. And these are just a few of the pictures that I took while I was there. This is what Beirut was like. A lot of rebuilding going on, but there's a lot of devastation. You could clearly see the effects of the war. Uniquely, as far as I'm aware, the Druze version of reincarnation argues that you are reincarnated. The moment you die in one physical body, you are immediately reincarnated as the first breath in a newborn baby. So it's not the moment of conception, it's a newborn baby. Humans reincarnate as humans, not animals or inanimate objects, and always as the same sex. And in fact, Druze reincarnate as Druze, Christians reincarnate as Christians. As I've said before, the number of Druze souls was fixed since 1042, and I was even reassured by one of the really high-up sheikhs that even skeptics are reincarnated, so I'm okay. They don't believe in karma. Instead, they believe that across all the incarnations you'll have, you will experience many, many different kinds of life, from absolute luxury to absolute poverty and misery and pain. And in that way, when Judgment Day comes and you're standing before God, he can judge you properly because you've lived in all those different circumstances. Now, there are certain problems with the Druze version of reincarnation. First of all, there's an obvious empirical test there for that particular version. Do the times of death correspond exactly with the times of birth in the reincarnated body? No, they don't. Surprise, surprise. What you do find is that there's a very short interregnum period, as we might call it. It's around about 6 months on average, and according to Stevenson, that's the second to shortest of all the cultures that he looked at, all the societies he looked at. So there does seem to be some kind of social pressure to at least make it a very short intermission, but it doesn't correspond. Now, Stevenson explained this as maybe being down to the fact that the Lebanese aren't very good at record keeping. A bit of a weak one, that really, and certainly wouldn't explain any of the ones outside the Lebanon. The Druze themselves have an interesting explanation for this apparent anomaly. They say that what's happened is that in between this life and the one you can remember, there was another short, unmemorable life. So, if there's a 6-month gap, there was a child that was born, lived for 6 months, died, and then you reincarnate again into your current body. Now, if you stop and think about this, as we've no reason to believe that it wouldn't be a different situation for those people who didn't have a violent death, if it applies to everybody, it implies that for every person who is alive, there was one short, unmemorable life, so a very high infant mortality rate. And I'm pleased to say that the statistics don't support that. So again, empirically, it just doesn't work. There's also problems with the fact that clearly the Druze population has not remained constant. How do the Druze themselves answer this? Well, they kind of believe that there are Druze all around the world, often in far-off lands, far-off countries that they know very little about. They often talk about China in this respect. So if the population's going down in Lebanon because of the civil war, well, it may well be compensated by an increase in China. Even though they don't know about it, that's probably what's happening. Okay, so Jad, who actually believed in all kinds of interesting things, he believed that there may well be Druze on other planets. So that could also explain it. So it becomes a completely non-falsifiable hypothesis. And also, just to make life even more complicated, you can be a Druze without even realizing that you are one. So there were a number of the people we met. They were lovely people, absolutely. I was quite worried when I went out there, smart-ass skeptics say, no, you're all wrong, they'll take out a fatwa on me or something. But actually, they were fantastically hospitable people. They were so friendly. But they believed that more than one of them suggested that maybe Roy, because of his interest in reincarnation, was actually Druze, even though he didn't realise it. Now, a typical Druze account, because they do seem to follow, there's variation, but there's a kind of fairly stereotypical story that you'll hear. The idea would be that when a child is first born and first begins to talk, they'll sometimes say things that don't make an awful lot of sense to the parents. But as the language improves, it becomes obvious that what they're actually saying is referring to memories of a past life. So they may say things, for example, they may say to the mother, "You're not my mother is so-and-so who lives in the next village." Or they may, as they're driving past a factory, say, "I used to be the boss in that factory, I used to own that factory." Or whatever, all this weird kind of stuff. And it's clear that these are past life memories, according to the Druze. Also, these kids often have some very advanced skills. I've got a picture. There's a little girl with a little Druze girl with a rifle. But again, it tends to be the kind of little boys who could kind of dismantle and reassemble a rifle kind of in 0 seconds flat, or show great interest in engines or whatever it may be, because the person that they are the reincarnation of already had those skills. What will happen then is that the child will pester the biological family, to arrange a meeting with the past life family. And at first, the current family will be a bit resistant to this. They won't particularly want to do it, but eventually they'll give in to the pressure from the child, and a meeting will be arranged. Now, it's claimed that when these meetings occur, nothing is given away. There's no clues, no information is accidentally leaked or anything like this. And in fact, if anything, the past life family will try to trick the child. So they'll take the child into the house and say, "Oh, and this was your bedroom." And the child will say, "No, it wasn't. That was my brother's bedroom. This was my bedroom over here." And of course, the child's always right. These are the kind of typical accounts that you would hear. Or even more dramatically, the child will go over to a cupboard, open the cupboard, remove the false bottom of the cupboard that no one knew was there, and there's the family jewellery or a bunch of money underneath, as proof that they are the genuine reincarnation of whoever they're said to be. Then the past life family, overwhelmed by the evidence, will accept them as a genuine reincarnation of their lost loved one. Well, again, we couldn't. Well, I'll show you at the end. I'll show you a little video clip, which is the nearest we could get to arranging one of those first-time reunions. But neither we nor Ian Stevenson nor anybody else has actually been able to record, is that actually really how it happens? One of the interesting things that happened during the making of the programme is we went to a particular school where quite a lot of the kids had reported having past life memories, and they got them all together in one classroom for us. It is rather weird to have 21 kids who all claim they have past life memories all in a classroom together. So it was 2% of the children at that school. And so if you extrapolate that to the Druze population as a whole, you can see that, okay, it's 1 in 50, it's not every kid, but that's a lot of children who claim to have these memories. And then I'm going to show you a video clip now from the programme. Apologies for the quality, because at the time, I just recorded it on the old VHS and only recently started putting clips into a talk. So it's pretty crappy quality, but you get an idea of what was happening. So I'll show you. I like a bit of dramatic tension, so I'm not sure whether the clip will play or not. So let's see how it goes.
To show Chris and Roy how common it is for Jews to remember their past lives, Jad has arranged an extraordinary reception at a local school.
We asked if you would get together for us some of the children who remember past lives in the school. I wasn't expecting to see this many, this is incredible, but I've never been in a room with so many children that remember past lives.
Let me ask them here if they'd like to talk to you about their story. مين بحب إنه يحكي قصته لضيوفنا؟
20 to choose from.
Yeah.
Excellent.
I'm sure.
أنا اسمي ربيع عبدية. كان اسمي سعد حلال. صار في حرب اسمها حرب المرابطون. سمعت صوت قوي كتير، انفجار. قلبت على الأرض وما حسيت بشي. الجيل الماضي كان اسمي فوزي مطر. كنت عم بشتغل على الجرافة، اجتني قذيفة بظهري متت. من محبوس. الجيل الماضي كان اسمي الحمام. كنت عم بحفر بالتكتيل. اجتني قذيفة بالحرب.
حياة السابقة كان اسمي رامز حيدر. كنت اشتغل بيبسي، كان عندي كمين بيبسي لإلي. بصيروا قاصر علي، لأنه يعني بصير تطلع روحي وبموت.
Right, now, right. Some observations on what we've got in the classroom. First of all, most of the kids in the school didn't claim to have a past life memory. As I said, it's about 2%, which is pretty damn high, but it doesn't mean that 98% didn't claim to have any past life memories at all. Of the ones that did claim to have past life memories, most of them were too vague to even check out. It would be, I was driving along in a Jeep and I got hit by a shell and I came into this body. Well, where do you go from there? There's nothing to check out. You've got no detail. But there were some cases that were more detailed. You saw some examples of that in the little clips I just showed you there. But of the more detailed cases, most of them just didn't check out. So, for example, there was Ramiz Haidar, Rami Abu Aram, who claimed to be Ramiz Haidar in a previous life, the Pepsi truck driver. Have I got this? Yeah, that's right. We went down to the depot in Beirut where he said he'd worked, at the Pepsi depot, and we asked the supervisor who'd worked there for 25 years, said no, nobody of that name's ever worked here. So he didn't check out. Mehdi Hibouz claimed that in his past life he was Melem Melurb, that he was killed while digging with his tractor, and he gave the names of his wife and children, and there was someone of that name with those wife and children. Oh, sorry, no, there wasn't. Sorry, I got that wrong. Yeah, get mixed up with a different case. When we checked the names of the wife and children, it was the wrong. There was somebody who was killed in that way, but the names of the wives and children didn't check out. Jad who was, as I say, was a very firm believer in reincarnation, suggested, oh, maybe he just got confused. Maybe he was actually the best friend of Melem Melurb, but now he's now thinking that he was Melem Melurb. Well, you know, if you want to find that convincing evidence, that's up to you. But there was an even bigger problem, that eventually we tracked down the family that he claimed to be the reincarnation of, and they said he can't be. We've already got the reincarnation. We know who the reincarnation is. So unless you can reincarnate into two separate bodies, at least one of these kids, it was a false memory. Now, why are these kind of cases important? Well, they're important because they provide the appropriate context to try and judge those few cases that make it into the parapsychology literature. I mean, basically, most cases not checkable, but of those that are, in our experience, most of them don't check out. And if you only focus on the hits and miss all the misses, you're not seeing the full picture. It's like judging a psychic by just the predictions they've made that have come true, rather than the far more numerous predictions they've made that haven't come true. So you need that appropriate context, I think. They also provide evidence that these kinds of claims are very, very common in Druze culture. And also, it shows that at least some of these claims must be false memories. So the challenge then is to prove that they're not all false memories. We focused in the documentary on two cases in particular. I've only got time to talk about one of them now, but that was the case of Rabia Abu Dayab, very appealing little kid. If he'd turned up on my doorstep and said, I'm the reincarnation of your granddad, I'd have said, I know you are, mate. Come in, have a cup of tea. And, you know, we'd been the best of friends. He was a very, very appealing child. And he claimed that he was the reincarnation of not only an international footballer, but also a successful pop star. And my initial reaction was, yeah, right. Of course, it turns out this person really did exist. His name was Saad Halawi. And, of course, with him being so famous, there was information all around. There was magazine articles, TV interviews. He was killed heroically in the Civil War. I mean, the guy was a national hero, you know. So it turns out that Rabia's mum was a huge fan before Rabia was ever born. So there was not a great mystery as to how we might know some stuff about Saad Halawi. Before I went out there, again, rather naively, and being the empirical scientist what I am, I was thinking, well, how can we test this properly scientifically? I thought, maybe if we get out there and we find a case where they know who the past life family is, but they haven't made any contact yet, we could control the conditions of that first meeting. We could take a kid into the house and say, okay, is this your Uncle So-and-so? Is that your Uncle So-and-so? Or is that your Uncle So-and-so? Showing them photographs. And then we can judge the probabilities, and then we can work out a p-value, and I'll be happy. That was so naive. Didn't work like that at all. The memories typically were kind of, you know, vague, fleeting, and so on and so forth. But in an attempt to try to prompt more memories, we took little Rabia down to the football stadium where he used to play. We took him into the trophy room. And we were hoping that if anything would prompt memories of his life as a football player, that would be it. So the next clip is us in the trophy room.
As everyone waits for Rassam to finish the training session, there's an opportunity to take Rabia into the club's trophy room to test how much he can really remember of his time as a player here.
Do you see anything here that you remember? Does it bring back any memories?
Are these the trophies that you helped to win?
What do you recognise? Anything at all?
This is my picture.
That's you. What's that ball? Do you recognise that?
Take this down, have a closer look. Do you recognise this?
This is my name.
تتذكر توقيعك انك انت وقعتها؟
مش بصير. نتذكر كل شيء بالضبط.
Look, from my experiences, that we have to give him some time to remember, because it doesn't quite work like you come in and then you start asking.
Sure.
So, shall I have a go with him and see?
Yeah, by all means.
Yeah. ربيع، هلا بتحب الفطرية انت مش هيك؟ هلا الغيها هاي الغي هلا تفكيرك هلا. ارجع ورا بتفكيرك لحياتك القديمة لما كنت تحب هذه الفطرية. هاي الغرفة كلها بتتذكرها؟ بتتذكر اشي فيها؟ فكر، رجع بذاكرتك. مين كنت تشوف؟
كان يشوف عالم كتير.
He's saying he remembers when he enters the room, he would see lots of people in it. He remembers, kind of vaguely.
Yeah, kind of vaguely, I think. Anyway, what might be a possible non-paranormal counter-explanation? Well, I think, yeah, again, this has to be to some extent speculation, but this is what I suspect is probably going on there. When the children first begin to speak and they're coming out with stuff that's unclear and blah, 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 that isn't just something that happens to Drew's parents, it happens all around the world. Anybody who's got kids knows that. In our society, for example, utterances that we might kind of just explain in terms of an imaginary playmate would be interpreted in Drew's society as possibly memories of a past life. I mean, why not? They all believe in it. It's, you know, that's a natural thing to do. And just, I mean, as anybody who's got kids will know, they sometimes come out with just bizarre stuff that you just can't make any sense of. But, you know, we try and make sense of things. That's what humans do. So within that context, it's likely that if the kid's coming out with a lot of this stuff, that the parents will speculate about who the past life might have been. Now, one thing within Drew's society is that it's a very close-knit society, as I said before. They're not meant to intermarry with other religious groups. Whenever anyone dies, they go from village to village announcing the death, and people will come and look at the body in the coffin and so on and so forth. There's great wailing and gnashing of teeth and all that stuff. So there's lots of routes for information transfer about, who the past life person might have been. Once they've got a candidate that they think is likely, then they're likely to want to try and test out that hypothesis. Oh, that's nice. Yes, this happens occasionally, don't worry, people. Right. They're likely to want to test out that hypothesis by kind of asking the child, if they think they know who it is, do you remember the time that you did this? Do you remember the time you did that? And of course, what they're doing unintentionally is laying down the groundwork for the formation of false memories. Once the child has been introduced to the past life family, if they accept the reincarnation as genuine, then that opens up even richer channels for more information to flow in. So bear in mind that all of those stories I told you, the kind of typical story where it's proven that this must be a genuine reincarnation, they're all stories that are told several years after that initial meeting took place. So are they actually accurate in terms of how the meeting took place? Or is it in fact the case that there may well have been lots and lots of information leakage there to be picked up on? Well, again, we don't know. The closest we could get to that was we arranged, in little Rabia's case, some members of his past life family he had already met, and some had accepted him and some hadn't. But he hadn't met his past life half-sister. We asked her if she said she was keen to meet him. He said he was keen to meet her. So they arranged a meeting. And I'm going to show you that in a second. They did it very sensitively. They made sure that anybody who didn't need to be in the room, including myself, was not in the room. Just the kind of cameraman, the sound man, and the director. And, well, I'll show it to you, and you can decide for yourself whether she gives any information away about who she might be. He's been told he has a surprise visitor, but bear in mind that a couple of days before, we have actually said to him, would you like to meet your sister?
صدقيني هذا اللقاء كتير مهم بالنسبة لي. لما خبروني إن خيي معطي يعني انبسطت صدقيني، يعني حسيت من جوا إنه كتير كنت مبسوطة. دليل مهم بالنسبة لي هو إحساسي، هذا هو اللي بيخليني أحس يعني إنه هو خيي أو لا، يعني شعوري أهم شيء. يعني هذا إذا بدك يكون حلم يعني بتمنى يتحقق أكيد. يعني إنسان كيف بدي أقول لك يعني خي يعني بالنهاية اللي عشت معه، واللي بحب رجع كل ذكرياتي أنا وياه، اللي بحب رجع صداقتنا، اللي بحب رجع كل شيء معه.
All Rabia knows is that he has a visitor. Summer is keeping her identity secret because she wants to see whether he'll recognize her.
مرحبا.
ربيع مش هيك؟ طلع في منيح. تعرفني؟ ما تعرفني؟ ما بشبه حدا تعرفه؟
مش عارف.
طب ربيع مش زعلان من أختك لأنه بعد هلا ما شفتك؟
أنا مش زعلان لأن ولا شفت في منهم بقولوا لي إنه مثلا متأثر الواحد وفعلا ماشي بصير.
يعني عندك شعور إنه إذا أختك يمكن ما شفتك أو ما قدرت شفتك لسبب هذا مش لسبب تاني؟
ممكن.
قاعد معي مرتاح، عم تحكي مرتاح ولا مضايق؟
لا مرتاح، بس في شغلة بشعر فيها إنه صار في شبه أنت وأختي كتير 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 كتير.
أنا أختك.
شعوري صح قلت لك.
مبسوطة كتير إني شفتك، كنت حابة أشوفك من زمان.
وأنا أكتر.
Well, I thought she gave him one or two clues. So, I mean, again, that was beautiful. That was lovely. The acceptance was purely on an emotional level. She so wanted for this to be the reincarnation of her beloved brother, and he wanted, he wanted that too, and it was great. Okay, just to quickly then finish up. Even if the Druze version of reincarnation, or indeed any version of reincarnation, isn't true, there are benefits to believing in reincarnation. Specifically, and the obvious first one, I think, which we just saw evidence of there, helping the bereaved to cope with the loss. Also, it reduces fear of death. The Druze have been a persecuted sect for centuries, and they have a reputation for being fierce warriors. Their battle cry is, "Tonight in my mother's womb." In other words, if they are killed in battle, they will be immediately reborn. That gave them that kind of courage to be very, very fierce warriors. There's also increased social cohesion. I've already said they don't intermarry with other religions, or at least they're not supposed to. Some of them do, but it's a minority. But on top of that kind of close biological network, there's a lot of cousins marrying cousins and so on. You've also got this past life network overlaid on top of that increases social cohesion even further. It's also been noted that in virtually all cases, probably 95% plus around the world, that the past life family are typically of a higher social class, social order, than the current biological family. I mean, in this case, little Rabia lived in poverty like I have never seen. It really was heartbreaking. Whereas his past life family were very, very rich. They were dripping with gold, and they were very, very influential people. So if they accept him, we all hoped they would, and she did, then they might not actually directly give money to support him, but they'll keep an eye on him, make sure that opportunities come in, and make sure he's okay. So that was great. So in conclusion then, most Druze children don't claim to remember past lives. Of those that do, most are unable to provide checkable details. Of those that can, most of the details are untrue. The few cases where it's claimed a large amount of detail was recalled and verified are all cases in which the past life family accepted the claimant as a genuine reincarnation many years before, and memory distortions are extremely likely in these cases. And finally, it's probably to the advantage of the Druze that they live their lives as if reincarnation really happens, even if, in fact, it doesn't. So I'll leave you with one final thought from Professor C.D. Broad. I think I might say that for my part, I should be slightly more annoyed than surprised if I should find myself in some sense persisting immediately after the death of my present body. One can only wait and see, or alternatively, which is no less likely, wait and not see. If you're interested in this stuff, I've written that particular stuff we've been talking about is a chapter in this book, Parapsychology, the Science of Unusual Experiences. I've also got chapters in there on possession and exorcism, and UFO abduction claims, and a co-written chapter on belief in conspiracy theories. So I've written bloody quarter of that, actually. Thank you for listening. Thank you.